Chairman, thanks for the opportunity to speak on the committee stages of this bill, and this will be the first of a number of calls that I'll be taking in this area, because obviously this was a bill that had its genesis in decisions that were taken through a Labor cabinet, and in fact the bill was introduced in my name prior to the last general election. Since that time it was picked up by the now Minister for Regulatory Reform, and I place on record my congratulations to the government for having a Minister of Regulatory Reform. It is an excellent concept, same as we were the government that had a Minister for Small Business. It is worthwhile having somebody who's pretty much their single focus in that portfolio space is on small business. In the current government, this concept of regulatory reform as being a significant driver for the government is one that we support on this side of the House. And I guess that I was kind of a de facto Minister of Regulatory Reform because of the work that I did on the Quality Regulation Review. I think a number of people have spoken on this bill and have talked about this bill being the outcome of the Quality Regulation Review. It isn't the only one. It's only one small part of the Quality Regulation Review, which had a whole lot of different streams of work. And one of those streams of work, even though it did seem to cause one Jonathan Young some angst there, was the idea that I had spent my time travelling around different parts of New Zealand getting feedback from business. I actually found that the most enjoyable part of the review because it was something that I was directly involved in. And some of the changes that we got made were directly as a result of that one-on-one engagement. And I found that there were really small things that were utter irritants to business. And by just removing some of the clutter, that actually assisted business get on with their primary job. Now, not all of the provisions in this legislation fit within this category, and I know that the Green Party are going to talk about the changes to the Conservation Act, and so I thought that I would comment on that one initially, but certainly do want to come back in on some of the others as well. We received very few submissions on the bill. In fact, I can't remember the exact number of submissions that we received, but actually there were very, very few indeed. What was it, 12 or so? It was a very small number. And the issue that came up on the question of the changes to the Conservation Act were actually focused on a misreading of the bill and what it proposed to do. And what the argument was that the argument that was brought to the Select Committee was that this would apply to leases. And of course leases are not covered by the proposal. It is simply licences that are. So let me just put on record what the response from the Department of Conservation was. And it was the Federated Mountain Clubs of New Zealand that made the opposition. They said the club opposed extending the term of permits to 10 years, with permits presently granted for a maximum of 5 years. The submission questions the justification for the changes, particularly in terms of freeing time spent on processing permits, so more time can be spent on planning and environmental monitoring. The Federated Mountain Clubs considered that this is more about the Department of Conservation prioritising than about business compliance costs, and note that most businesses obtaining permits are small, flexible businesses that do not require upfront investment to operate, while they would benefit from greater business certainty by obtaining a longer term permit. This does not outweigh the rights of New Zealanders to comment on the land's management. The response from the Department of Conservation was over 300 new permits are applied for each year, with at least the same again being reissued each year. In obtaining a permit, significant staff and applicant effort occurs. Reducing the regularity for seeking a permit will reduce effort and cost and enable effort to be better placed in improved planning and management of concessions. Permits are granted for many activities, including some which require significant financial investment, e.g. aircraft landings, boating, guiding, grazing. A longer-term permit will provide greater certainty for investment in these opportunities. Mr Chairman, the Department of Conservation's planning processes enable opportunity for public engagement on how public conservation lands and waters are managed over a 10-year period. And so certainly when we considered this matter at the Select Committee, it was felt that this was an issue that did fit within the purview of the legislation, but more importantly, that the question of environmental protection and public engagement with DOC over the estate was reasonably left to the broader planning role of the Department of Conservation, rather than requiring people to apply every 5 years. Now, interestingly, I actually thought that we had some information in here, Minister, which we don't have. I haven't been able to find it in my notes since I realised that this was going to be a debatable issue in the context of this committee stage. And so one of the pieces of information which I think would be useful for the House, if the Minister could supply it, is how many of those 300 applications per annum are renewals and how many of them are challenged. Because if the reality is, as I seem to recall the advice we got at the Select Committee, that almost none of them are challenged because they're ongoing concessions, then it would seem to me that we might be trying to, to make dare I say, a mountain out of a molehill. Probably not fair because it was the Federated Mountain Clubs that raised the issue, but that would be incredibly useful advice for the debate. Would be how many of them are normally opposed, because I don't think that, my recollection is that very, very few, if any, that are the long-standing concessions in our DOC estate are in fact in any way challenged by anyone, and have been a great opportunity for people to get engaged with our conservation estate, especially in terms of our tourism industry. There might be slightly different now with mining on national park land, but there you go. We'll that's probably a debate for a different occasion. Mr Chairman, the other issue that I just thought that I would touch on was that there were a number of submissions in relation to the hazardous substances legislation as well. And one of the problems with the way that the submitters came forward was that it appeared that they hadn't quite realised that the bill wasn't changing any of the GMO provisions in the legislation. And so we ended up hearing a couple of submissions where people were genuinely concerned about something that genuinely wasn't happening. And there was nothing in the bill that we had before us that addressed or affected the regulation of genetically modified organisms, as any changes to the regulation of such organisms is likely to be contentious, and the purpose of this regulatory improvement omnibus bill is to address relatively minor regulatory problems. So again, Minister, I think it would be useful if the Minister is to put this on the record, that this is not an intention of this legislation. It never was an intention of this legislation. And I understand why the submitters, who were utterly genuine in the submissions that they were making, but sometimes it's useful to, possibly it was useful that they brought the matter to our attention just to show that this is an issue that will continue to be of importance across New Zealand. But in this particular case, it wasn't an issue that required the attention of our committee, because the bill itself, in fact, did not cross the line into the area of genetic modification. So I think just with those opening comments, I think that would be useful to have some clarity from the Minister, and if we can get those additional points of information to assist the House in the debate, I think that would be very useful.
Mr Chairman.
I call Ross Roberts.